A man sits in a lonely, quiet house in the middle of the night, unable to sleep. His 2 children are up in their rooms, sleeping on the floor. The night grows long and stale when a foul stench drifts in from the outside. The man follows the smell, down the stairs, creaking with every step, to the front door, to the porch. The street is swallowed up by the dark. No shape or light allowed, and the man has never been so alone. Until he isn't. Something shoves the man to the ground from the outside. The hallway about him is suddenly pitch black and freezing cold, and that rich smell of decay circles him. A sweet, furry stink of just beyond edible food, and the moss, and leather, and yeast, and feathers. The man looks up. A single, shiny, jet-black eye as big as the man's face blinks slowly from a leathery, wrinkled socket. Shh, it whispers. I won't leave until you don't need me anymore, it says. A gargantuan crow looms before him, high and wide, its wings enveloping him, a living shadow threatening to whisk him away, and yet, for the first time in too long, the man falls into a gentle sleep, and he dreams of afternoons in the forest. Just a few days before, the man's wife, the children's mother, died. There were no sirens or police investigations or court proceedings. One day, she just died. And now all that's left is Crow. This is the opening scene to Max Porter's Grief is a Thing with Feathers, a surrealist, almost magical realism novella about, well, grief sweeping through the door to whisk you away, and it's filled with powerful metaphors, perhaps the most important tool every writer has. People often restrict metaphor to those lines like, the tree was a skeleton, but it's honestly a lot broader than that with how we use them, how we think about them. They connect in with symbolism and allegory and analogy. The lines really blur between them, and it's impossible to understand one without sort of understanding them all together. So we're not just going to use that narrow definition of metaphor here. So today we're going to go through a ton of stories to really understand how metaphors work, how to create them, and what kind of metaphors will end you up in bad metaphor jail. Oh, hey, Ray's saying she's a Skywalker. What are you doing here?
The rat symbolizes obviousness.
Or like, look at this person holding a gold nugget covered in butterflies. This is a bad metaphor. For what, you ask? For the people who buy my books. A catalogue for the end of humanity full of amazing sci-fi and fantasy stories, pick that up, or on writing and word building full of all the educational content we talk about, like in this video. See, the gold nugget is the books, and the butterflies are the knowledge and happiness you'll get if you have these books. Anyways, let's talk writing. Part 1, the most important tool writers have. Metaphors are powerful assets in capturing complex and nuanced experiences which people might not otherwise fully grasp if you just play it straight. Like, Summer Porter's book is written from the perspective of the crow. It's this weirdly dark comedy, and like there's this one scene where he tells 2 children to build a model of their mother from string, buttons, cutlery, whatever they can scrounge together, and then the crow promises to bring this model to life, only to cackle and refuse when they do, and for the kids to then cook the crow alive. This is broadly metaphorical because we try to bargain with fate to deal with death, but death is an uncompromising god. We convince ourselves there's hope even if we know there isn't, and there's kind of this almost dark comedic side to seeing how helpless we are against the crow, against the universe, embodied in the crow's own laughter. But grief also never takes just one shape. It evolves, it changes, it's unique from person to person. It can be easy one day and harder than ever the next. Does it become rage or stillness or isolation? But all of this is why the crow shows up in multiple forms across the story. At the start, the crow forces its way into the man's home. We get that sense of invasion, insecurity, and helplessness, but then it also cradles the man. It helps him. The book itself says the crow is not a purely sinister presence, but neither is it kind. It is the, quote, antagonist, a trickster, a healer, and babysitter. It is never just one consistent feeling. Porter is only able to bring us closer to this very difficult emotion to really grapple with his cunning use of metaphor. Metaphors allow him to highlight, exaggerate, elevate certain parts of the grief, to turn something which is perhaps monotonous into a creative, striking visual image which catches our eye and stays with us. But let's also look at how Porter uses metaphors on a line-by-line level to describe the house they now live in. The house becomes a physical encyclopedia of no longer hers, which shocks and shocks and is the principal difference between our house and a house where illness has worked away. Ill people, in their last day on Earth, do not leave notes stuck to bottles of red wine saying, "Oh no, you don't cockcheek. She was not busy dying, and there is no detritus of care. She was simply busy living, and then she was gone. She won't ever use makeup, turmeric, hairbrush, thesaurus. She will never finish Patricia Highsmith novel, peanut butter, lip balm." We might not know what it's like to lose a wife or lose a mother, but we probably know what it's like to go through an encyclopedia, an endless list of things that we could never hope to comprehend all at once. An encyclopedia of no longer hers is this overwhelming, endless compilation of things we cannot hope to handle emotionally or psychologically. But there's also a mundanity to it, a textbook that eventually grief becomes ordinary. It doesn't go away, it just becomes a dusty book on your shelf. Metaphors can help us understand things more viscerally than stating them outright would. They can turn the unfamiliar familiar, and Porter's surrealism takes this to a whole other level. So when you're writing, ask yourself what features of a person, a place, or an experience that you're describing that you really want to drive home, that you might want to elevate with metaphor. If you're describing a city, maybe you want to highlight a tower, which will come back later in the story, or the sewers that the heroes will escape through. So you say, the city had deep roots, a network of sewers of old forgotten passages running underneath it. And is there a more universal experience you could connect something to? Like, listen to this piece from Toni Morrison. She was the third beer, the one you drink because it's there, because it can't hurt, and because what difference does it make? What a weird way to describe a person, right? But it works. It makes you take a step back. It forces us to think of something in new ways. It is unexpected, but in that, it becomes memorable. What does it say about someone who has the third beer because it's there and it doesn't hurt? There's character in there. But more than that, it's a shortcut. We don't know who this woman is, we don't know how they related to her, but we get an instinctual feeling of how that interaction might have gone through this metaphor, through a simple analogy that invites us to imagine what's around it. And using your reader's imagination is one of the most powerful tools we have. They bring so much to it. But more importantly, this sort of writing can tell us a lot about the person who would make that sort of comparison. You know, metaphors aren't just creative descriptions we can use as writers, but they're expressions of the character we have in front of us sometimes. A good metaphor will often draw on imagery which exaggerates a feature of something in a way which evokes a feeling, an instinctual reaction first that doesn't need to be explained, like the third beer. Saying she was the third glass of milk, the one you have because it's there because it wouldn't hurt, might be accurate, but it really doesn't work on the same level because it doesn't conjure that instinctual response we have. That lands you up in bad metaphor jail. Metaphors like these mean we don't have to describe everything, but we still leave a really strong impression. At its most fundamental level, a metaphor is describing something with a direct comparison, and that's why it really blurs the lines with things like symbolism, right? Of course, sometimes metaphors are ham-fisted and kinda cringe and not great.
The rat symbolizes obviousness.
But that's why Grief is a Thing with Feathers works so well. Porter really knows how to use them. Even the title, Grief is a Thing with Feathers, is a metaphor. And we quickly come to understand what that means because in the opening scene of the book, Porter describes how the man is left with, quote, feathers between my fingers, in my eyes, in my mouth, beneath me, a feather hammock lifting me up a foot above the tiled floor. He describes how the boys find feathers on their pillows and they're unwilling to disturb it, so they sleep on the ground. We like to imagine grief as being about the absence of something, right, or someone, but Porter makes it very clear that grief becomes a very tangible part of our world. It is an encyclopedia in which the turmeric, the peanut butter, the makeup, and thesaurus and Patricia Highsmith novel all become things they were not before. They all have this baggage attached to them, very physically. You can touch it. The ordinary suddenly holds all the weight of your pain. Should you move the chair that they last sat in? Should you clean that glass? Grief is the feathers which get everywhere, into every nook and cranny of your life, and there is always more. No matter how many you pick up, you keep discovering them. They, like grief, get in the way, making it hard to function the way you did before. The boys cannot sleep without their mother to tuck them in. The crow's constant bulging presence everywhere is all about how grief just takes up energy and time and brain power just existing with it. But if that's what a metaphor can do, then I want to tell you a secret about how to truly create a good metaphor. And that is, of course, part 2. interconnectivity. Metaphors are all about elevating something by connecting it to something more evocative. You know, like the tree is a skeleton because skeleton's got atmosphere and feeling, and especially if you attach those properties to the tree. So metaphors will often connect the imagery to something from another story, and to be clear, this isn't always great. It can end you up in bad metaphor jail, but some are good. Some can add real depth and layers. Like the title, Grief is a Thing with Feathers, is actually a reference to another metaphor in a poem by Emily Dickinson called Hope is a Thing with Feathers. It reads, "Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me." Like, let's think about what this metaphor now does. For Porter, grief is a thing perched in our soul. It gets to the very heart of our existence. It changes how we see the world. It sings a tune without words in here, and even if it goes quiet, it never truly stops, because we cannot go back to the person we were before it. And much like hope becomes strongest in the sorest of storms and strangest seas, grief can become strongest in moments of happiness and triumph. It can be difficult to allow yourself to feel happy again. Grief, in a way, is the only thing allowed to be real. The final line of Dickinson's poem speaks to hope never asking a crumb of her, but in contrast, grief asks everything. It infects everything. It inhabits your home, it takes up space. It is not just a bird perched in your soul, it is a dark, gargantuan crow standing in your hallway. Porter drags all of this meaning into that central metaphor by linking it to the Emily Dickinson poem. And in the same way, when we write a metaphor, we drag in all of that instinctual meaning that we attach to the imagery that we use. All the context and subtext. If I write, "She was a hurricane and I was a light rain," it drags in all the danger and brevity that she changes everything and everyone around her. So much of a good metaphor is about the instinctual kind of feeling of something that we drag in more than what we're specifically saying, and I think that's really cool. And this is because good metaphors are all about interconnectivity, connecting two things together to reveal some deeper third thing they share, you know, connecting it to universal experiences, to famous imagery, to other works, intertextuality, or even ideas and symbols within the story itself. Like, if you describe someone as metaphorically wearing a crown of thorns, it drags in all the biblical implications of that, the Messiah, the sacrifice, the resurrection. If you establish piano music as an important symbol of freedom in your story, and then write, "Her voice was a long-held piano note in the dark," that brings in all the connotations you've already established in your book. He drags in the myths and stories and symbolism of crows, of death and fate. This adds depth and meaning without much effort, and you can do this too. Hear me out, I know this is technically a simile, but again, all of these writing tools really mix and blur together, and it really demonstrates just how powerful figurative language can be, because arguably the greatest monologue ever written is Rutger Hauer's Tears in the Rain speech from Blade Runner. "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die." Just 42 words, and it is crazy just how many levels this figurative writing works on, how many ideas it connects to. Comparing memories to tears in rain is an immediately evocative analogy. Every single raindrop we know and we think is beautiful, almost perfect to our mind, but they're fleeting. They're dashed against the pavement and reabsorbed back into the earth without anyone noticing. It connects falling to death and fate. A tear in rain, because they may look the same to an outsider at a glance, at a distance, to someone who does not know it's a tear, that it seems made of the same stuff, but it is, unlike rain, so full of feeling and time and life and existence if you actually take a deeper look. Placed in the context of the wider film and story, where Deckard is hunting down replicants who others have decided aren't worthy of living, who aren't human like us, who have been labeled as monsters, this is him now seeing the replicants as just as human as him, if not more so. He is seeing the tears in the rain before they're inevitably dashed against the ground. This cyberpunk world is too perpetually raining, as if it drowns out all other life. we might feel insignificant like a single raindrop, but in this moment, between these two, soon to be forgotten in the grand scheme, in this downpour, they are not. And then the replicant lets a dove fly off into the air, resisting that pull to the ground that tears and rain both have. Not only does the writing here help us understand something better than Betty explaining it outright, him saying, "Oh, I'm human too, I'm just the same as you, I too feel and have a soul."
The rat symbolizes obviousness.
No, it's this wonderfully memorable image, perfectly connecting with other imagery inside the film itself, and also to just universal experiences that we all understand and know, adding to their meaning as they all interconnect. The irony being that this moment will not be lost in time. It forever changes Deckard as a person. This is why when people talk about metaphors, it's way too restrictive to just think about the lines like the tree is a skeleton, because it's so much more than that. We can go so much deeper, and I really want to expand how we think about our writing. Like, listen to this passage from Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now, it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places, faded or stained. The Lottery is about a dystopian society where every year, people draw lots from this black box to decide who should be stoned to death as part of some kind of ritual. Sounds fun, I know. The box is described as faded and stained and splintered along one side, but you might have noticed something here. The box literally does look like this. It is literally faded and stained, yes. But it is impossible to not see this as also metaphorically true. It is, in a sense, a metaphor for the outdated, twisted, degraded underbelly of this society who stones its people to death. The society is decaying. This practice is a stain on them just as much as it is a stain on the box. And it's hard not to connect the black box to the phrase black box, meaning a box of the unknown, the unimaginable, the stuff we don't understand that we might fear. Don't just think about how you can describe something, a person or a place, by comparing them to something else, but whether you might give them actual features which might, on some level, metaphorically reflect some part of their character identity or role in the story. And you can see how this already crosses over with like symbolism. Now, I don't mean like give your villains physical deformities because it reflects their true inner evil nature. No, straight to metaphor jail. I mean more like, what if a church has a broken steeple? Has God forsaken this place? Or if you describe protest graffiti being washed away in the rain after a government cracks down on them, then it might reflect the violence and oppression we see in the story. All of this gives a metaphorical layer to your writing. We'll take a look at this passage from Michael Cowan's Telegraph Avenue. Up all night, spinning 5 thoughts in his head. Gig tomorrow, brown and gold plaid. Bird needs his arthritis drops. Gas up the van, get to Leslie. Gig, plaid, bird, van, Leslie. Needle in a locked groove endlessly circling the spindle of his mind. Mr. Jones felt ashamed of that scanty midnight track list. When he was a younger man, his insomnia used to play it all. Sex, race, law, politics. Bach, Marx, Gurdjieff. All kinds of wild and lawless thinking, free format, heavy, deep and wide. Now, shit. Fit it all onto a 5-track EP going around and around. The lines we've highlighted simultaneously describe his thought patterns, but also a record player or music, the man himself being a musician. This isn't quite an extended metaphor, nor is it quite a single standalone metaphor. It's recurring metaphorical imagery within a paragraph, being used in different ways and adding a lot of character here. It might be a little too intense to do this sort of thing too often, but it is fun. It does show the sort of creative stuff we can do with metaphor. Describing how he used to live and think in a more free-format way says a lot about where he is psychologically now. But think about this kind of language. What does it mean to describe a room as smelling of isolation and loneliness, or a crown to be made of blood and iron? All of this adds subtext and foreshadowing and character. So I want to test you, I want to ask you, what do you think this metaphor from Gillian Flynn's Sharp Objects is hinting at? Outside the porch, I saw a changeling. The girl was in a childish checkered sundress, matching straw hat by her side. She looked entirely her age, 13. Actually, no, she looked younger now. Those clothes were more appropriate for a 10-year-old. Describing the girl here as a changeling, a mythical creature often swapped out for a child, foreshadows the revelation that this is not the sweet, innocent girl we are first presented with in the sundress, but a rebellious drinker and perhaps more. As a note, I do not think I've ever hated a character as much as I hated the mother in this book, and I cannot recommend it enough. Gillian Flynn is fantastic. And yet, for all of these fantastic shiny metaphors, do you want to know the #1 reason people end up in metaphor jail? It's because they don't, part 3, know when to use metaphors at all. I adore Gillian Flynn's writing, but when I was researching for this video, I actually found that she doesn't use that many metaphors, because she understands that writing beautifully and immersively isn't about finding the most beautiful metaphor, which is what people often assume, but instead finding the most interesting specific detail in what you're describing. Like that passage from before, describing her as a changeling, great, but describing how her clothes don't fit and they're actually more for a 10-year-old, that's way more evocative. That's like, why? What's going on here? And you get dragged into it. It's a fascinating little detail to narrow in on that really catches the eye. Or think about that description of the house as an encyclopedia of no longer hers. Porter could have described his house as a crime scene, every nook and cranny another splatter of his wife's blood. It would be an okay metaphor, but he instead has that line about turmeric and the thesaurus and ordinary house paraphernalia, which is so much more specific and relatable. The Patricia Highsmith novel brings us much closer to her life and his pain than any metaphor ever really could. Maybe instead of writing "the tree was a skeleton," describe the last leaf barely holding on in the winter wind. Fundamentally, the most powerful metaphors bring us closer to something than raw description ever could, but sometimes you just need better description. Porter, Jackson, and Morrison understand this. They don't assume metaphors are inherently deeper in some way or that they're better at showing over telling, which sometimes I think newer writers do. They assume metaphors are a better kind of showing, when what it really betrays is that you're not being specific enough with your description. So consider finding a more specific detail about something you're describing that captures some unique element of it before you turn to a metaphor. Part 4, bad metaphors. Bad metaphors muddy the meaning we want to give. Like, imagine if, instead, Max Porter described the house they now have to live in without her as a statue of some great conqueror with a rusty plaque. What does that mean? Like, I get what it's going for, you know, a statue is a sign of someone dead, it's got a plaque and all, but it's awkward. A conqueror is a very specific thing to compare someone to, but it's an image of violence, and I'm not sure the mother is in this story. It makes us ask, are we glorifying her? Is she a bad person? The rusty plaque might be about the pain of forgetting what someone is like after they die, but it also kind of suggests that she's not as great as the statue might suggest. It doesn't match the somber tone Porter went for. It's mixed messaging, mixed metaphors. Bad metaphors are also often a symptom of purple prose, overly complicated writing, usually too reliant on poetics. And if you've never heard of the phrase cErUlEaN orbs, then it is my honor to introduce you to it. cErUlEaN orbs is a famous metaphor for describing people with blue eyes, particularly common in the fanfic community. Like, there's an entire fan lore page dedicated to fanfic which uses this. Sam savored it for a moment as dark Godiva curls fell over Frodo's cErUlEaN orbs. Straight to metaphor jail. And when she caught me with those beloved cErUlEaN orbs, straight to metaphor jail. Louis's eyes traveled to Harry's, the love brimming for him in Louis's cErUlEaN blue orbs. There were no love behind those two pulchritudinous emerald orbs. There were no love at all. Jail, jail, jail. As a Wattpad veteran, yes, I know my crimes are out in the open. The cErUlEaN orbs is a staple of the fanfic genre, but it's not good. It's needlessly complex, the terms cErUlEaN and pulchritudinous meaning just blue and beautiful. You can tell when people use a thesaurus to find words which they just think are more beautiful, or they go too hard on the metaphors, like describing eyes as an orb, which is just a sphere with possibly religious overtones. It abstracts the description without adding depth, and it certainly doesn't bring us closer to understanding what Harry's eyes look like, or the homoerotic love he shares with Louis. Bad metaphors leave people trying to to puzzle out precisely what you mean, especially because they will sometimes drag in other connotations or meanings unintentionally, rather than them engaging with the ideas underneath you're trying to get at, which is what a metaphor is really meant to bring us closer to. A lot of this, at least for me, comes down to editing, where you go through the story and you end up stripping back a lot of the metaphors which might attribute too much importance to something which ultimately doesn't matter that much, and then that sort of muddies the meaning that you're trying to communicate. But good metaphors can do what specificity can't, especially when we're talking about Part 5. Metaphors versus realism. Metaphors aren't just about describing something, but engaging with the readers sort of empathetically. And in that, metaphors can boil down an experience to what it really matters for them to feel. Like, it's no wonder mental illness is so often expressed symbolically and metaphorically, like in Turtles All the Way Down, where John Green has intrusive thoughts in capitals and uses a spiral as a motif to represent spiraling thoughts, or the yellow wallpaper, where the wallpaper itself is a metaphorical prison for this woman in society, or like this passage in A Worm Beneath the Skin.
A worm itches under Marama's skin, somewhere between her inner thigh and knee. A skinny creature, twitchy and wriggling, so that when she comes at it with fingernails, it always manages to slither out of the way. It comes and goes, dormant most of the time, but when it wakes, it becomes all Marama can feel, and the itch becomes a burn as her blunted nails scrape across her flesh, red and raw. Tender is good. Tender keeps the worm still, paralyzed, fearful of where she might target next. Some nights, Marama goes at it with tweezers and tries to pluck its head out, pluck all the little hairs, ingrown included, leaving a dozen red pinches of flesh. Other nights, she uses wax strips to tear at the whole thing at once. Not one, but 3, maybe 4 yanks before the worm settles down. Then, all she feels is the red burn, like a boiled flannel pressed into her skin, and the worm becomes the least of her worries.
I'm going to talk a little bit about self-harm. If you don't want to talk about that, skip to this timestamp. This is a story about body dysmorphia. For people who don't have it, it can be really hard to understand why someone would want to do this to themselves. But the idea of an insect underneath your skin immediately makes it seem almost rational. You would scratch and tear at your flesh as well. Now, while the crow in Max Porter's book is a broader symbolic metaphor in the narrative, passages like this are called extended metaphors. They're used in prose over paragraphs or sentences to develop layers to kind of a standalone metaphor, recontextualizing it with new character action, feeling, imagery, and details before usually being left behind. A Worm Beneath the Skin is actually a story of mine, very different to what I usually write, but I'm really proud of this one, and you can read the rest of it in A Catalogue for the End of Humanity, which is mostly full of like sci-fi and fantasy stories, like a family who has lived with a book of death in their library for generations, or there's a now Pushcart Prize nominated story about a crew of scientists following a strange signal out into the wilderness, or how about a whole novella about an AI pulling strings on a distant colony, turning its inhabitants into something, but why and what? And yes, I will say there's a bunch of really cool metaphors in this book that I am really proud of, and even better, if you don't want the physical copy, there is now an audiobook as well, which is beautifully voiced by amazing voice actors. Murphy, Larissa, Tim really brought them to life in ways that I'm really happy to hear. Murphy, you actually just heard, just got a great voice, and all of that is linked down below. And even better, you know what? Every story in this book has incredible art. I was so stoked to see this sort of thing come together. I love it so much. So many of the artists are actually from this community. I thought that was really cool. Most importantly, the paperback, the physical editions are cheaper than ever. In fact, you can get it like 50% off right now, just in time for Christmas. I wanted that to be available. Thank you to the thousands of people who have already bought it. It really does mean a lot. If you like my writing, if you like my channel, these sorts of videos, then this is the book for you. If you want to take your writing and world building to the next level, that's why you're here, then these books are for you. And there's a ton of exclusive content and analysis which I couldn't put into these videos because of how YouTube works. And every single one of these books covers completely different topics, so you can pick the one which covers the stuff that interests you most. Or you can just get all of them. That's one I recommend. Thank you to everyone who's gotten so far. It is really meaningful for me that I'm able to sort of sponsor my own stuff with my own stuff. Means a lot. Links below. In a way, every story we tell is a metaphor. They're always about something bigger, revealed in the intersection of plot, theme, and character. But to truly understand the power of a metaphor, I want to tell you about one of the most powerful stories I have ever encountered. What Remains of Edith Finch. Part 6. All Stories Are Metaphors. Edith Finch is a 2017 magical realist exploration game divided into a series of short stories, sort of. One about each family member and their fate as a child explores their old abandoned family home. Each one is profound in its own way, but perhaps the most famous is that of Lewis Finch. Lewis works in a fish cannery, with fish sliding down towards his workstation, where he has to behead them and send them onto a conveyor belt, over and over and over and over. And he starts daydreaming. The story here is about the daily struggle with the monotony of life, of feeling trapped in a dead-end job, feeling isolated, imprisoned within your own mind and no sense of a future for yourself, losing passion and drive for this world and life at all, so why care about reality in the first place? Lewis starts to imagine himself on this fantastical adventure story, and it starts to take over the screen, quite literally. But crucially, you as the player are involved in this story. You have to participate. You have to keep doing the movements to cut the fish, slide the mouse across, chop it, send it onto the conveyor belt. One half of you is in the factory, the other in the brighter, better world than this grim reality. The metaphor extends from the game into reality, as you repeat the monotonous movements of the character, but barely think about it. It slips into the subconscious while you're wholly fixated, wholly drawn into this other story, like Lewis. You play out the escapism, the same way we and Lewis convince ourselves we have some control over what we're really doing, that we have some control in our life. The story isn't just about what it means to withdraw from reality, to become numb to our own suffering, for the world to no longer feel real in the way it did before. It asks, is the real you the one who actually has to work the terrible job every day, or the hypothetical one with dreams and ambitions but hasn't had the opportunity to live them out yet? My imagination is just as real as my body, Lewis tells his therapist. Until, at the end of the story, you walk past Lewis in an out-of-body experience that, in a metaphor itself, up the conveyor belt, by the mountain of dead fish, to the light, where Lewis takes his own life, in a public execution of his mind. The whole thing captures that inescapable feeling of being a cog in a machine in a beautifully metaphorical way, the pit we can find ourselves in. In much the same way, Max Porter's Crow will stay with me for a long time. Antagonist, trickster, babysitter, therapist, the dark bird just waiting to sweep through the door, the way only beautiful writing can. I wanted to talk about What Remains of Edith Finch because it shows how metaphors can operate differently in different mediums. Maybe you're doing a TTRPG, or you're doing a film, or a game, or a book, or a poem. They have kind of different tools and different rules that you can play with. If metaphors are all about trying to connect things to other more evocative ideas, you can do that differently in different mediums. With player controls in games, with improv at the TTRPG table, with visual symbolism in a film, with wordplay or grammar in a book or poem. But let's bring all of this together in a summary. Metaphors are one of the most important tools a writer has. Use them to bring people closer to an idea than describing it outright would, often by drawing a connection between something unfamiliar and something familiar, or something instantly more evocative. 2. Metaphors force us to look at things in new ways, often by using unexpected connections, making them more memorable. Which elements of a scene or description do you want to stick to the reader? Do you want to elevate? They form an important part of the impression you leave. 3. Extended metaphors allow you to develop a central idea over multiple sentences or paragraphs. 4. Good metaphors are often about interconnectivity with universal experiences, other works, famous imagery, or ideas and symbols within the story itself. Consider how other motifs or symbols in your story might impact how we interpret metaphors, the depth we draw out of them. 5. Metaphors aren't just X is Y. Consider giving metaphorical layers to things in your story with their actual features, or recurring language patterns that can create a metaphorical layer to something. 6. Know when not to use a metaphor. Oftentimes you just need to be more specific with your description rather than add more poetics. Ask if the comparison fits the tone of your description, whether you're accidentally introducing other meanings that are unintended, and whether the metaphor elevates something important in the scene or you're writing purple prose. 7. Grab my book, A Catalogue for the End of Humanity and On Writing and World Building, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. Links down below. Stay nerdy, grab my books, and I'll see you in the future.